was thinking about where do we start that's like an interesting place as an on-ramp to go from. And I kept coming back to the study you were involved in that was published last year on protein. And I found that study to be very interesting. I know that we exchanged some emails at the time, and I've spoken about it a couple of times on this show, at least with Dr. Willard and Dr. Nagra. But I've never had you on the show to go through it in detail. And what's always kind of interested me about that study is that, as you know, protein right now is trendier than ever.
Yes.
And a lot of the major podcasts, like the Huberman Lab or Peter Attia's show or Gabrielle Lyon, they are a very protein-focused, protein-centric kind of messaging within their podcast. But I was really surprised that, at least to my knowledge, none of them covered this study.
Okay.
Which really surprised me. So maybe you can walk us through what that study was, why you guys conducted it, and then we can get into some of the interesting findings.
The rationale behind why we decided to do this was, if you think about clinical dietary practice guidelines, they generally recommend to consume more plant protein than animal protein, but there's generally never like a recommendation of how much, like what should that balance actually be. So we decided to look at a ratio. So it's a plant to animal protein ratio, which is based on % calories from plant protein and animal protein. Everyone gets a ratio, and that is kind of their breakdown, who's eating more or less animal or plant protein. So that was kind of the rationale to see if we could find like maybe an optimal point for health. And specifically for this study, we looked at cardiovascular disease. So we looked at total cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And we did this in the Nurses' Health Studies 1 and 2 and Health Professional Follow-Up Studies. So those are the large cohorts based out of Harvard. It's about 200,000 people, 30 years of follow-up. So we used the food frequency questionnaires to analyze these ratios, and we did it every 4 years. So
So that data had already been collected in the past.
Yes.
And you're going back and conducting an analysis from that.
Yes, it started in the 70s with the NHS 1 and up to 2020, basically. And we did 17 FFQs or food frequency questionnaires. And then we used like a cumulative average. So we were more interested in like long-term exposure to this type of ratio versus like baseline, like you see in a lot of other studies. And what we found was that a higher plant-animal protein ratio, so that is more protein coming from plants, was associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly coronary artery disease, but not stroke.
Was there an optimal ratio for that?
So we did what we call a dose response analysis, where you kind of map out everybody on like a graph to see where they fall with their risk for cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And it was really interesting because it wasn't totally like a linear association. We see that the risk drops substantially at the beginning, and then it kind of plateaus. And particularly for cardiovascular disease and stroke, that was about 0.5, the ratio, which is not actually that much plant protein, really. But for coronary artery disease, it continues to go on.
So to put that into context for people, the ratio of 0.5 would mean 1 gram of plant protein for every 2 grams of animal protein?
Basically, yes, exactly.
So that's what you found for cardiovascular disease.
And stroke.
And then for coronary heart disease, the ratio, there was still improvement going more towards like 1 to 1?
Yes. So in that one, it kind of just stops because we don't have enough people at the end, but it looks like more plants seems to be better for coronary artery disease compared to stroke.
Okay. And then the other interesting part of this analysis that I found was you went further and you also looked at whether or not protein density affects the outcomes. Can you explain that? Because that seemed to be a quite a novel kind of component of this analysis.
That got a lot of attention. So protein density is just being % of energy from protein. Most people get about 16 to 18%. That's what we saw in the cohorts. So what we did with this is we call it like the joint effects, where we would break up the ratios into 3 groups, so high, medium, and low ratios, and high being more plant protein, and then split it into different protein density groups as well. Low, medium, and high, which was about 16% in the low, 18% in the medium, and 21 or so percent in the high. And what we found was that the plant to animal protein ratio, so higher plant protein, combined with higher protein density, had a lower risk of cardiovascular disease and coronary artery disease.
Right. So just to throw that back to you, the first finding is that having a higher plant to animal protein ratio seemed beneficial for these outcomes.
Yes.
But you can that's a ratio. It's not speaking to absolute amount of protein. So you can do that within a low total protein diet, kind of moderate or a high.
Yeah.
And the individuals who had that higher plant to animal protein ratio and were consuming higher amounts of absolute protein, which was near 20% of calories or 18% of their total calories.
About 20%.
About 20% of total calories. They did even better than those who still had the high plant to animal ratio but had low total protein intake.
Yes, like 16%.
So what is you're a registered dietitian as well, right?
I am, yes. Yeah.
So this is why we have you in the studio.
Right.
So you're a scientist and a registered dietitian. So how do you take all of that scientific jargon and findings?
Yeah.
And how would you apply that either personally in your life or if you were educating someone sitting in front of you who was asking you how to eat for healthy cardiovascular health?
Yeah, it was an interesting finding. And I think if you look at table 1, which shows like the baseline characteristics of the participants across the ratios, we did see that those with higher ratios were consuming less protein and a bit more grains. So I think what's happening with this protein density finding is that they're eating more legumes and nuts because those are higher in protein. And we know that those are really good for cardiovascular disease prevention. So I think we didn't look at that specifically, and that's something that we're going to do for another paper that's going to come out. But I think what they're eating here is they're eating higher quality, more protein dense plant sources.
What is interesting to me, back to why I was surprised this wasn't picked up, was that protein's definitely having its moment. Firstly, it's interesting to me that people that are promoting high protein diets didn't find this interesting enough to share it, right? Because it seems to me that beyond just total protein amount, thinking about where that protein's coming from is important and should be part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
But then secondly, I think this research also challenges sections of the plant-based community that for decades have really said, protein's not really a nutrient that you need to focus on. You get enough of it without thinking about it. And in fact, low protein diets are better for long-term health.
Yeah.
So if someone's heard that message and then they're hearing this now about the more protein-dense diet being better for these outcomes, how should they be thinking about that, or how would you encourage them to think about that?
I think if you look at the graph, all of them are significant if it's low, high,
right,
or medium. So I think, even if you're eating a lower protein diet, you're still getting those benefits. But the extra risk reduction, it's an interesting finding, and I don't think too many studies have really looked at this before. But I do think it really highlights the quality of the diet, and that we should probably be focusing more on like tofu and beans and nuts compared to following a more lower protein diet in that sense.
Summer sleep can be brutal, and I want to give you a better tool than just blasting the air conditioning all night long. Here's the thing that many people miss. Your core temperature has to drop for you to fall into deep sleep. And what actually matters there is the surface you're lying on, not just the air in the room. That's the gap 8 Sleep fills. It's a smart mattress cover that sits on your existing mattress and cools or heats each side independently anywhere from 12 to 43 degrees Celsius. If you've got AC, the pod works right alongside it. You're cooling the bed directly instead of the whole house, so you can ease off the thermostat a little and take some load off that summer power bill. And if you don't have AC, this is the one. It turns the bed from a hot, restless, sticky, kick the sheets off situation into somewhere comfortable you actually sleep through the night. My side runs cool, my partner's runs a little warmer, and nobody has to negotiate. Here's the really clever part. 8 Sleep adjusts the temperature of your side of the bed according to your body temperature, the room temperature, and the stage of sleep you're in. Cooling the sleep surface before you get into bed helps you drift off faster and supports deep, slow wave sleep. And keeping the temperature in the right zone overnight means you're not getting the thermal disruption that negatively affects REM sleep later on, the stage of sleep where memory consolidation takes place. Use my code THEPROOF at 8sleep.com/theproof for up to $350 off. You get 30 days to try it at home and return it if you don't love it. That's code THEPROOF at 8sleep.com/theproof.